within the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, I would say the biggest chunk of those, I can't give you a percentage, but the biggest chunk of that are individuals who are motivated by some form of white supremacist ideology. And that group, the racially motivated violent extremists, has been responsible for the most lethal activity of the last few years.
In September of 2020, during a House Homeland Security Committee hearing, the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, warned that the threat of domestic violent extremism was growing. 3 months later, hundreds of people violently stormed the nation's capital, fueled in part by the racist, white nationalist rhetoric shared by President Donald Trump and his allies. Today, we learned that the intelligence community also received warnings that this could happen and that those warnings went unheeded, that there might be armed violence on January 6th, that the plan was to literally kill people. And that attempt to topple our democracy after, not incidentally, black voters helped secure a victory for Joe Biden, that is an example of what writer Wesley Lowery calls a white lash. In his new book, American White Lash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress, Lowery writes, each step toward triumph gained by the anti-racist side sparks a backlash, a pullback on the rope from the unjust system's beneficiaries and boosters. Lowery posits those white fears may be the defining force of our time, the undercurrent beneath the thrashing of our society, politics, and culture. And as long as there are elements within our mainstream politics and media willing to cynically play to those fears and unwilling to call racism and bigotry by their rightful names, we can expect additional bursts of white racial violence, the horrific calling card of our era. Joining us now is the author himself, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of American White Lash, Wesley Lowery. Congratulations on the book, sir.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me out.
And, I mean, just such an essential thesis to help understand what's happening in our world today. I mean, there's a reason so many of the stories we're covering go back to this central notion of white grievance, white rage, and just the fear and anger towards a changing America. I wonder, as we talk about January 6th, this contention that we would have had a vastly different response. I think it was the head of the D.C. National Guard, William Walker, told the January 6th committee, it would have been a vastly different response if those were African Americans trying to breach the Capitol. Do you agree with that?
I think there's no question. I think that what we've seen across our history has been our institutions and the institutions that are charged with defending our democracy, whether that be law enforcement, whether that be our political parties, whether that be the press very often, have been extremely sensitive to the idea of any black radical ideology, right? The fear of some type of revolutionary black movement rising up, and have been largely negligent when it comes to undermining, infiltrating, and preventing violence from what is the oldest terrorist movement in the United States of America, a white supremacist movement. People who would preach that Americans who are not white are not entitled to full humanity or full citizenship. And so what we see, and we know that the populist nativist movement that Donald Trump leads is not only about race, right? We know that there is a collection of grievances there in the same way that the rise of the Klan in the 1920s was not only about anti-black racism. It was about concerns of the urbanization of America and Catholics and Jews and immigration. And so what we see is that we have movements like this who plan their coups in public and yet still are not prevented. And I think it speaks to some of the failings of our institutions in this moment.
I just wonder, I mean, the degree to which we have not only normalized white rage and white violence, but institutionalized it as well, right? If you look at the origins of police forces, some of them sprang from slave patrols. Like, when you have a country that is founded, that has institutionalized racism, how do you get to a more perfect union when you can begin to see not just the existence of white nationalism, white rage, white racism, but begin to combat it? I mean, how do you unwind that?
Well, and I think that, you know, I think that's one of the crucial questions. I write in the book, and we referenced it a little bit, that so much of our American history has been a tug of war between diametrically opposed forces, right? Forces of white supremacy. And I don't mean that colloquially. I mean the literal foundation of our government being a racialized caste system where white people were fully human and other people were not, right? And on the other side, you have these anti-racist forces who are pulling and pushing. I think one of our difficulties is that we tend to overestimate, and white Americans, polling shows, tend to overestimate or overinflate what they believe the progress towards that has been, while other Americans, those who are likely to be victimized by these systems, suggest that far less progress has been made than their colleagues. In this moment, when we see massive demographic change, the rise of a black presidency, a new civil rights movement, cultural changes, what we see are white Americans, who the majority of whom, according to the polling, by the end of the Obama years, believe they themselves face racial discrimination in the United States of America, right? That white Americans now believe, in essence, that they are an oppressed, racialized group. And I think that speaks to a lot of the reactionary politics that we see.
Well, don't forget that the Obama years were, followed by the Trump years. Correct. When you have, and this is kind of a bigger question, but when you have someone like Donald Trump, who has normalized racist dog whistles at best, explicitly racist language, rhetoric, and calls towards racist violence at worst, how do we as a society deal with that? And I would ask, like, as a journalist, a member of the media, right? There's always this tension between, okay, Donald Trump is a front runner in the 2024 presidential race. What he is saying is irresponsible, again, at best, and a directive towards violence at worst. How do we cover him in a way that is responsible to the role he plays as a figure on the national stage, but also responsible to the fact that he, in many ways, does incite violence?
Of course. I think that it is a complicated question. I don't want to oversimplify it, right? But I also think that we can be more thoughtful than we have been collectively, and I don't think it's as complicated sometimes as we make it seem. I think that the reality is we know that dehumanizing rhetoric and dehumanizing language paves the way towards violence towards the people who have been dehumanized, right? And so if we have a major political figure who is going to traffic in such language and be so divorced from reality, it's our responsibility to cover that person in contextualized ways, to not serve as a signal-boosting platform for them, right? Not just screaming or live tweeting every racist utterance, but rather always wrapping those things in context. What would it look like? And this is, this is in some ways an incendiary example, but frankly, I don't think that is. What would it look like if Louis Farrakhan was running for president? We would not all day, every day be live tweeting everything he says about Jewish people. Why would we not do that, right? Because we understand that by the function of that, we are just spreading the lies. We are spreading the rhetoric. We are normalizing it. That when people see their most base prejudices reflected back on public stages, it gives them a permission structure to now express them themselves.
So as we talk about that, there's an explicit example. There's an explicit policy area that is kind of like the hotbed of some of the most disgusting and violently racist rhetoric, which is whenever you have Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis talk about immigration. To me, on the outside, immigration feels like the kind of county fair where Republicans are invited in to give their most to dehumanize brown and black people in a way that is explicitly racist, but is sort of covered by the veneer of questions of legality and what we're going to do about the thorny policy issue of immigration, right? It's like the hall pass that you can have to express white rage and white grievance and white racism, and direct it at a group of brown people while still remaining in polite society and not being deemed a racist because you're talking about undocumented people. Let's talk to me about the way in which you feel. What do you think of the suggestions that have been made thus far on the part of, let's say, Ron DeSantis? I think it was yesterday, announcing his plans to end birthright citizenship for Americans born in America, people born in America.
Well, I think that's an excellent example of what we're talking about, where it masquerades as a policy issue and policy debate, but reality is the expression of vibes, right? Aren't these people scary? It isn't the country changing in ways you don't like. Let's remember the 14th Amendment, which legalizes birthright citizenship, was a corrective to the Dred Scott decision, right? So this is literally our remedy to the Supreme Court saying that black people are subhuman,
right.
Was our birthright citizenship creation. Secondarily, the president can't get rid of it. That's not how the Constitution works. So this is completely messaging, right? It's not actually a policy proposal. I think about the interview that Gavin Newsom did recently with Sean Hannity. And they have this back and forth about immigration. And Hannity lays out all his talking points, and Newsom goes, well, look, I think we should solve this, and the biggest problem is the brokenness within the system. Let's talk about the visa policies, and let's talk about the process, and let's talk about the line, right? That if we want to solve the issue of our immigration system not working, there are actually like bureaucratic things we could do, but none of those things are the things that our candidates are talking about. I think that gives away the game. It speaks to the fact that this is about messaging, it's about the feeling, it's about playing on an anxiety. It also cuts to a real rich history. What people forget is that when the Klan was at its most powerful in the 1920s, its major victory was an immigration bill in 1924. That this idea of how do we keep other people out, how do we define who is an American and who is not, which makes us think about the birther movement. And is this black guy who got elected president, is he really one of us, right? This question of, are the children of these immigrants, are they really one of us? It speaks to a very base prejudice that is currently aggravated and activated among many of our fellow Americans. It's effective politics. It's why Donald Trump was able to get elected. It's why we saw the Tea Party wave in many places. It's part of what we saw on January 6th. But it imperils people and imperils people's lives.
I'm with you. I think this is the central argument in American politics and American life, which is who gets to be an American, what country are we, and who belongs here. I mean, I think it animates almost everything in our country today. It's such a timely book. It's an essential book. Wes, thanks for writing it. Thanks for coming on the show to talk about it. Wesley Lowery, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of American White Lash. Good luck with book sales and the book tour, my friend.
Thank you so much.